everyone. This is Milton, here to talk about Blades of Khaine again. So, different factions and Kill Team have their strengths in different places. Some have it in their durability, some in the sheer number of idiots that they have to throw at problems, and some have it baked into their data sheets or into some combination of their rules, their ploys, and their equipment. For Blades of Khaine, a lot of the team's strength is in its faction rule aspect techniques. Now, it may seem a bit strange to spend so much time talking about a faction rule in Kill Team when so many faction rules are really straightforward, but aspect techniques is actually 16 different rules stapled together, and the level to which you have access to them depends on your team composition. So, the goal for today's video is to talk a bit about the faction rule aspect techniques, and then to talk about our different choices of operatives and team selection. Finally, some thoughts on when you might want to pick different team compositions. There's going to be 3 separate videos where I'm going to break down in more detail the aspect techniques for Dire Avengers, for Howling Banshees, and for Striking Scorpions, just because I want to be able to give some better examples, kind of mocking up some different situations from games, and really illustrate how to use those techniques in a way that would make this video tremendously long when there's already plenty to talk about here. I also want to make it very clear that this is my opinion, and there are folks that have had success with other builds of the team than I've used. Now, I am drawing on information from conversations online about what has worked for other players as well as my own experience. And like I've said before, I will try and get other folks involved for a video or interview if this channel ends up having enough reach to make it worth their while. So, this is based on my experience. I have quite a bit of experience with the team, but I don't want you to think that I am endorsing this as the only way to win with Blades of Khaine. So, on to the faction rule. And I'm going to go ahead and pop this up on the screen. But this is worth reading through word by word. Each aspect technique is in a category: Dire Avenger, Howling Banshee, and Striking Scorpion. Each aspect technique can only be used with a friendly operative that has the matching aspect keyboard, and you'll see those on their data cards. And each will specify when it can be used and what its effects are. In addition, 1. You cannot use more than one aspect technique per activation or counteraction. Notice that it doesn't say friendly action or counteraction, so you can use aspect techniques during an opponent's activation as long as it's a technique that says you can do it if you're not the active operative. 2, you cannot use each aspect technique more than once per turning point. Each aspect has 5 different techniques, so under normal circumstances, you can use each one once. And 3rd, if every friendly Blades of Khaine operative selected for deployment has the same aspect keyword, e.g. Striking Scorpion, you cannot use each aspect technique more than twice per turning point instead of once. So, like I said earlier, we're not going to break into each of these techniques yet. But the reason that I mention this now is because there are relevant reasons to take a team that is all Striking Scorpions or all Dire Avengers or all Howling Banshees. I usually play with a mixed team. A lot of folks do, but it is worth keeping in mind how things change if you're running all of the same aspect. So, with that said, we're going to go ahead and get into the discussion of specific operatives. So, keeping in mind the aspect technique rule and how that affects team composition, let's talk about our specific operatives that we have access to. Blades of Khaine only has access to 6 data sheets, which I'm pretty sure is the fewest in the game. Your team will consist of 1 leader and 7 warrior models for a total of 8 operatives. And there are 3 choices for your leader model and 3 choices to fill out those warrior model slots, so you'll only ever have between 2 and 4 data sheets on the table at once. Let's look at the warriors first, and then at the leaders. All of your warrior models will have the same basic stat line, with different weapons and a different special rule. So, all of your warriors will be a 7-inch move, APL 3, with a 4-up save, and 8 wounds across the board. For Dire Avengers, their special rule, Defensive Tactics, gives them accurate 1 when either the Dire Avenger or its target is contesting a mission or objective marker. Accurate lets you retain 1 die as a successful hit, so you can just set it aside as a success. You don't roll it when making your attack roll. Excuse me. The Dire Avengers have a very mediocre melee attack that you will almost never use if you have a choice in the matter, and the Shuriken Catapult, which is their real purpose. The Shuriken Catapult is the team's only option for shooting at long range. Everything else only has a Shuriken Pistol and an 8-inch range. Other than the range, Shuriken Catapults and Pistols have the exact same stat line. They're 3-4 damage with Rending. What Rending does is if you retained any critical hits in your attack roll, you can turn 1 normal hit into another critical hit. With only 4 attack dice, this means that against most enemies, Dire Avengers will deal a bit of damage. But sometimes you hit the lottery, they get multiple crits, and hang a ton of damage at whatever they're shooting at. This is important to keep in mind, and we will come back to the importance of Rending when we discuss the aspect techniques, because those play into your crits. It's also important to keep in mind that Accurate and Rending are not really a combo. They're a little bit of a non-bow if you run the math on exactly how it shakes out against most enemies. If you're retaining a hit, you're rolling 1 fewer die and have fewer chances to get that crit that you really want. Excuse me. Now, Accurate can stack up to Accurate 2 by making use of Vantages for shooting attacks, and it is important to keep in mind that this rule applies to all of their attacks, and they can get Accurate when throwing grenades that you get with your equipment points. This is very relevant since grenades normally hit on a 4-up instead of a 3-up. We'll talk a bit more about grenades in the upcoming video on equipment, but wanted to throw that out here now because it is quite relevant for the Dire Avengers and their specific role. Next up is the Howling Banshee Warrior. Same base stats as Dire Avengers. Instead of defensive tactics, they get the Banshee Mask. When a Howling Banshee is fighting, i.e. is the one initiating a fight action because retaliation is different in this edition of Kill Team, the enemy worsens their hit stat of their attacks by 1. For a lot of more elite teams, this isn't a huge deal, because they may have access to rerolls or 5 attacks on a number of their melee operatives, so they'll still get enough hits to kill you. But it does increase the odds that they whiff on a roll. Against operatives that already hit on 4s, however, this can be pretty punishing, and it can really make the difference between somebody getting 1 hit or not any hits at all. And it's always worth looking at your operatives' data sheets, because some teams may have certain melee specialists that have a huge weapon that only hits on 4s, like the Legionnaire's Butcher or most Power Fist models. Putting them down to hitting on 5s is a huge difference in how many attacks they have to go through, and those models generally make for really good prey for your Howling Banshees. Excuse me. Howling Banshees also have a Shuriken Pistol, which is exactly the same as the Dire Avenger's Shuriken Catapult, but at an 8-inch range, and they have a Power Sword with 4 attacks. Power Swords are just generally a good weapon in Kill Team. A lot of teams only get 1 model with a Power Sword, and it's their leader. Power Swords deal 4-6 damage with lethal 5-up, allowing them to crit on 5s and 6s in melee instead of just 6s. Most of the time, if you're rolling 4 dice, you'll probably get a crit on a melee attack roll, and those 6 damage crits hurt. So Howling Banshees are generally best when charging your opponent, limiting the enemy's number of successful hits, and taking chunks out of even tougher enemies with their crits. The final option for warriors is the Striking Scorpion Warrior. Again, there's a Shuriken Pistol, works the same as everyone else's, but instead of a Power Sword, the Striking Scorpion has a Rending Chainsword that deals 4 damage on a normal hit and 5 on a crit. Their special rule is Manda Blasters, which deals 2 wounds to an enemy when the Striking Scorpion initiates a fight action. Again, like with the Howling Banshees, the Striking Scorpion has to be the active operative, so if somebody else charges you in a fight, you don't get those 2 wounds. And these 2 wounds happen before any dice are rolled or resolved for combat. So, if your enemy is on 1 or 2 wounds, the Striking Scorpion can start a fight action and finish them off with absolutely no chance of failure without having to roll any dice. It also really changes the math on what they can easily kill. Melee and kill team works differently than shooting and has no armor saves. Instead, you and your opponent roll your attack dice, then take turns either dealing damage with one of your dice or using one of your dice to parry and remove one of your opponent's successes. So running into a melee with a thing that has more wounds than you is quite a risk, because your opponent may be able to afford just tanking some damage and keep punching you back and kill you. Since the attacker resolves their dice first, though, the best case scenario is that you want to fight something that's already wounded or otherwise in a range where you can kill it with 1 or 2 hits, and you take minimal damage back. For striking scorpions, those 2 wounds from Mandiblasters mean that if you get a crit, you can outright kill a 7-wound model before it gets a chance to strike back at you. Mandiblasters plus 2 normal hits lets you kill a 10-wound model very reliably, only taking 1 swing back in return, as long as you're the one initiating that fight action. So it's really important to keep in mind where those melee damage breakpoints are for any melee and kill team, but especially for Blades of Khaine, because the Howling Banshees and the Striking Scorpions, you really want to be doing a lot of your work in melee. So to summarize, so far, we have 1 ranged warrior that doesn't deal a ton of damage unless he crits, but if he does, can really spike a lot of damage through. And we have 2 melee operatives that are looking to be the ones initiating fights so that all of their abilities go off. So now let's take a look at the 3 options for leaders, or the exarch models. Each of the 3 leader models for the team are slightly better versions of those 3 warrior models we've just discussed. They have slightly better stats and some additional weapon options. As far as their stat lines goes, each of our leader options goes up to 9 wounds instead of 8, which is pretty standard in kill team. Most leaders tend to get an extra wound. Our leader models also get a better save stat, going up to a 3-up armor save against shooting, which is quite nice and is not something that usually changes in kill team. They retain the special role associated with their aspect. So Dire Avengers get defensive tactics, Howling Banshee Exarchs get the Banshee Mask, and Striking Scorpion Exarchs get Mandiblasters. They also get the rule Exarch, which allows them to do a second fight or shoot action during their activation. This means that your Exarch models are not only a bit more durable than your other models, but they also have the potential to hit harder at range or in melee, getting double kills or putting down a tougher enemy that your normal warrior models might struggle with. So first, let's take a look at the Dire Avenger Exarch. So the Dire Avenger Exarch has a couple of potential loadouts. You can choose between a Shuriken Catapult and Fists, Twin Shuriken Catapults and Gun Butts, a Dire Sword or Power Sword paired with a Shuriken Pistol, or a Dire Sword or Power Weapon paired with a Shimmer Shield. The Fists and Gun Butts are pretty awful melee weapons, so if you want an Exarch with a ranged weapon, the choice is pretty clear. The Twin Shuriken Catapults are definitely the way to go. They are the same as a Shuriken Catapult, but they get the rule Ceaseless, which is very good with rending. What it lets you do is it lets you reroll all of your dice of a specific value. So all of your 1s or all of your 2s in your attack roll. This makes the Exarch very reliable shooting, and you'd be surprised how much damage it can deal even against harder targets in combination with the various aspect techniques. If you want to go with a melee weapon on a Dire Avenger Exarch, the choice of Dire Sword or Power Sword is mostly going to depend on the wound values of what you're fighting. Anything 10 wounds or under, and you're probably best off with the Dire Sword so that you get those additional crits with rending. 11 or 12 wounds, you're probably best off with a Power Sword, just because you can potentially get 2 6 damage crits and finish off a slightly tougher model. But the real decision here, the most meaningful one, is if you do decide to go with a melee weapon on the Dire Avenger Exarch, what you take in your other hand. You can take either the Shuriken Pistol or a Shimmer Shield. Generally, the Shuriken Pistol will probably do the most for you, since most of the Dire Avenger aspect techniques specifically work when you're shooting with a Shuriken weapon. So if you take, the Power Sword and you don't have a gun, your Exarch just can't use a lot of the things that you may want to use. Now, the Shimmer Shield Doesn't give you a ranged attack, but it does allow your model and any other models within 2 inches to ignore piercing. And that does have some potential use cases into teams like Inquisitorial Agents, who right now can take an obscene number of piercing weapons. And that's their game plan, is just to keep shooting Melta and Plasma at you until you go away. Ignoring that piercing is actually quite strong, and against some of these teams that may only hit on 4s but have piercing weapons, can actually put them into a space where they're not very reliable to kill you. It's also potentially funny to combine the Shimmer Shield Exarch with a portable barricade equipment so he can shuffle around the table with a 2-up save, ignoring piercing, and then just, throw accurate grenades at people. I can see it working in some specific matchups. I don't know that it's necessarily great or what the team really wants to be doing, but I felt like I should mention it because it is kind of funny. So, for full disclosure, I have not played a Dire Avenger Exarch in a competitive game yet, not this edition. I still need to rebase my Exarch, with the Twin Shuriken catapults onto the right base size, because I've got it set up for previous editions of 40k. But talking about it with some folks online, I think there are several scenarios where the Twin Shuriken Exarch could be really strong. So if you want a long-range shooting model that can shoot twice, the Dire Avenger Exarch is pretty solid. Or if you want a weird equipment Voltron in certain matchups, the Power Weapon Shimmer Shield Exarch is an option. It's probably not our best one. So up next is the Howling Banshee Exarch. Here you have 5 different potential loadouts. You can take the Mirror Swords, which importantly does not come with a ranged weapon. You can take a Shuriken Pistol and Executioner, a Shuriken Pistol and Triskel, a Shuriken Pistol and Power Weapon, or a Triskel and Power Weapon. The Mirror Swords are just a power weapon with Ceaseless, which is pretty good. You give up the option of a normal shooting attack, like I said, but you do have the option to shoot with equipment, so grenades, or to use one of the aspect techniques, which does give you a ranged attack. And if you're fighting something where power sword attacks are good, this is a good general purpose option to get a bunch of crits and to just try and put big damage through on something very reliably. The Executioner is not my favorite because it has a slightly awkward melee profile. It does deal 7 damage on crits instead of a power sword 6, so it can one-shot 7 wound enemy operatives, and it does have lethal 5-up, so you have pretty good odds of getting that crit and finishing those models off easily. But if that's your main goal, there is a Striking Scorpion option that does 7 wounds a little bit more reliably, in my opinion. I have seen an argument for taking the Executioner into Space Marine teams, since 2 crits does just kill a full health Marine. That's certainly interesting, but in my opinion, it feels somewhat risky, since you strike with that first crit, and then your opponent does have a chance to parry before you resolve your second die. So if they have a crit and you don't have a third one, they can stop you there. So it is an option, albeit not one that I've played in that type of matchup myself in this edition. And having the 3 damage on the normal hit is a bit of a letdown. It's just a lot worse into a lot of wound break points than the 4 damage from a normal hit from Mirror Swords or a Power Weapon, or even the Triskel. So the Triskel as a melee weapon is worse than a Power Sword. It's 4-5 with Rending, instead of 4-6 with lethal 5-up. And as a ranged weapon, it's less good than it was last edition. It's only 2-3 damage. However, because it has Rending and Torrent 2, it does have some utility if you want a Banshee Exarch on Into the Dark against like a full Horde team, say Deathcore, where a Triskel is going to kill them in melee as effectively as a power weapon would. And it opens up the option of having a Torrent shot hitting potentially a cluster of enemy models if they're grouped up, and getting shots on a bunch of enemies with lethal 5-up because it's Into the Dark, and Rending, so you can just force through a bunch of crits and deal a surprising amount of damage. However, your crits still only deal 3 damage, so you'll probably wound several operatives, but you're not at amazing odds of just killing them. The Shuriken Pistol and the Power Weapon is fine. That's just the normal equipment that you get on a Howling Banshee. Certainly not bad, but usually there's a more ideal option for your exarch. So finally, let's talk a little bit about the Striking Scorpion exarch's options. You have 3 potential loadouts. You can either take a Shuriken Pistol and Biting Blade, a Shuriken Pistol and Scorpion's Claw and Chainsword, or Twin Shuriken Pistols and Twin Chainswords. The Biting Blade deals 5-6 damage with Rending, which is pretty huge damage. And this is important because after considering Manda Blasters, a Striking Scorpion exarch that initiates a fight action is dealing 7 wounds with Manda Blasters and 1 normal hit. This means that against normal human teams, he can kill something in melee without taking any damage in return, which is huge. A second normal hit would put him up to dealing 12 damage, which is another important breakpoint. Now you're knocking things out like Phobos Marines, only taking 1 shot in return, which is pretty big. The Scorpion's Claw is basically a power weapon with Brutal, and it can only be parried with critical hits. So it also has the potential to deal big damage since it comes with that lethal 5-up. Because you have 5 attacks with lethal 5-up, you should generally get at least 1 crit in an attack sequence. And this means that the Claw can reliably finish off 8 wound models in a single blow after your Manda Blasters, between that 2 damage and then a crit for 6. With 1 crit and 1 normal, you're dealing 12 damage. 2 crits plus Manda Blasters gets you to a cool 14 damage, and is finishing full health Space Marines in 2 blows. So, similar to the Howling Banshee exarch with the Executioner, where you want to force 2 crits through and you're potentially killing a Space Marine, same thing with the Scorpion Claw exarch. Excuse me. And finally, the Twin Shuriken Pistols and Twin Chainswords. These are a bit more niche, and I personally don't have a model assembled for them at the moment. You end up with a 5-attack Rending 4/5 Chainsword with Ceaseless, and a Ceaseless Shuriken Pistol that hits on 4s instead of 3s. Last edition, there was an argument for taking this into 7-wound teams, because some folks ran the math and it can reliably get a crit in melee, so you can one-shot 7-wound models, but the shooting isn't as reliable, so personally, I would pass on this particular loadout in favor of others that can more reliably get you the breakpoints you need on damage to get easy melee kills. Into those 7-wound teams, probably the Biting Blade. Into 8-wound teams, you're probably looking at the Claw. Now, with the Scorpion exarch, something that folks have asked me quite a bit, I do tend to run the Scorpion exarch in most of my games, and here's why. When the team came out, my local group was just starting what would end up being a roughly 10-month-long narrative campaign. Will had put together a system that sort of took the old Kill Team narrative rules and then smashed a bunch of the Necromunda rules onto it. And it was really cool. But it came with really limited rosters. So if you lost operatives, there was really no guarantee that you could buy another Aspect Warrior. And so I had 1 exarch and played with it for 10 months. So I played a whole lot of games with the Striking Scorpion exarch with the Claw and the Chainsword. And so I just have a lot of comfort level with it. And it is quite good into a lot of melee breakpoints. It's never a bad option, but if I'm not 100% sure of what I want to run, that's usually what I default to, just because I have an absurd number of games with that model, and I'm fairly happy with the way that mine looks painted. So just figured I'd throw that in here. So now we've looked at our various options. We've talked a little bit about the faction rule. How does this play out? When do we make decisions on how many of each of these models we want on our team? So I am a big proponent of having usually 2 Dire Avengers. Because it's our only option to have any long-range shooting, I think it is important to have that because it keeps people honest. If you can only shoot up to 8 inches, people can go on an engage order, they can do all sorts of weird things, and you have really limited options to do anything about it. So, a little bit of Dire Avenger action, I think is quite important. So I'm usually running 2 of them. I'm oftentimes running 4 Howling Banshees, 3 or 4, because Howling Banshees, as we'll see when we talk about aspect techniques, are really good at going fast, getting into weird, hard to reach places, and killing something. So they are kind of the missile that I fire off to try and get something dealt with. The Striking Scorpions aspect techniques make them a little bit safer to stage up the board in certain situations and give you a little bit better tools to deal with shooting threats. So I oftentimes end up running 1 or 2 Striking Scorpion warriors and then a Striking Scorpion exarch, just because that's kind of my safety zone, right? Um, I may well end up changing those models around depending on the specific matchup, and we'll talk a little bit more about specific matchups. But the most important thing to keep in mind as you're making the selections on your leader model and on how many of each warrior you want are those damage breakpoints. Since we are primarily a melee team, even though we can have pretty good shooting, it's really about trying to take the 1 or 2 pieces that can get double kills, that can easily trade for more than they're worth and get you ahead on material in the game. Now, that's if you're running a mixed team, which I often do just because I spent 10 months playing it pretty regularly. But there are a lot of times where you may want to run an entire team of one aspect. This got fairly popular last edition because all Howling Banshees could do some weird things to people. So if you're looking to play with all of one aspect, that's where I would recommend that you start. Get together 8 Howling Banshees. If you get 2 boxes, you can build a couple different options for your exarch. And the strength of running all Howling Banshees is that you get to use the Howling Banshee aspect techniques multiple times, which in my opinion are most of the time our strongest options. And they're particularly good into melee teams. So if you're playing against something like Felgor Ravagers, all Howling Banshees is not what they want to see. It's just a rough time for them. It's also really interesting on certain maps or certain layouts of Volcus because Howling Banshees have a technique where they can basically fly and ignore vertical distance. So you can just get those melee pieces into places that most teams would not be able to and can really threaten people. So that's the main time that you would want to run a lot of Howling Banshees is either into a melee matchup or if you think you can stage safely and hide Banshees and then start, just catapulting them at people over walls. Striking Scorpions, like I said, are conceptually there are stealth models, right? So they have a technique where they can get what we generally call super conceal, where if you're in light cover on a conceal order, you can ignore rules like seek light or vantage for people shooting at you, and it can make it so that you can stage up the board a little bit more safely. And if you're into 7 wound teams where a Striking Scorpion is killing things with 1, Amanda Blasters and then 1 crit, and the exarch can kill things with 1 normal hit, all Striking Scorpions can be a reasonable play. So into things like, say, Pathfinders, where they really just want to be shooting you. They don't want to be fighting you ever. Striking Scorpions can be quite solid. They will struggle a bit more into teams that have better melee tools than them. So, most of the time, if I'm taking all of one aspect, it does tend to be Howling Banshees. But there is a case in certain scenarios for the Striking Scorpions, and that's certainly worth playing. However, they do have some really bad matchups, because of damage reduction ploys. If you play against the Vespids, you can end up in a situation where it'll take 3 normal hits just to kill a Vespid in melee, even after Manda Blasters, and that's terrible. So, again, Like I said with the exarchs, it's really important to keep in mind what your opponent's general wound value is going to be, because that's going to be one of the big drivers of which operatives you want to take. And if they have a ploy that reduces damage, then you may not want to take those scorpions because you're just not reliably going to kill things in melee, where banshees may be able to force through 2 crits and get that damage that they need. Finally, Dire Avengers. So I have not played all Dire Avengers personally, not in this edition. There is an absolute maniac who took all Dire Avengers to the World Championships of Warhammer and did win 2 games. From what I've seen, it was a bit of a meme. I generally wouldn't recommend all Dire Avengers most of the time because the Howling Banshee and Striking Scorpion techniques are quite useful, and you really do want some legitimate melee threat on your team. However, being able to double up on the Dire Avenger techniques, can be quite powerful. Like I was saying, Dire Avengers have rending on all of their guns, and rending is better the more crits you get. There's aspect techniques that can potentially let you get lethal 5-up on multiple shoot actions. And lethal 5-up, ceaseless, rending. Sorry, the cat just made a strange noise. Lethal 5-up, rending, ceaseless, shuriken catapults can do a shocking amount of damage, even to the hardest targets in the game. So, it is worth considering, but it does put you in a situation where you've taken what was previously a melee team and taken almost all of the melee capability away from it. So it is going to drastically change the team, the way that the team plays, more so than if you were going with all Howling Banshees or all Dire Avenger. All Striking Scorpions. Again, worth considering, but it is drastically different. Now, I don't want to get too into the weeds on how the specific aspect techniques work yet, because I'm about to start working on videos for each of those 3 techniques. But since we're talking operative selection, it is important to note that we do have the option to either take the mixed team or to take single. The cat might have just thrown up in the rug outside the door. So I'll go look into that. But thank you for stopping by. I will talk about the aspect technique specifically in more detail in a video that I hope to have up either tomorrow or early next week. And we'll go from there. Thank you all for checking out the video. If you enjoy the content, please like and subscribe. And hopefully I see you over aboard soon. Bye.